Welcome back. Thanks for joining me again as we get started on the primary benefits of cloud. In this lesson, we're going to talk about ease of use, basically how easy is it to use the cloud, or in our example, AWS. We'll talk about flexibility in the cloud, cost effectiveness, scalability and elasticity, and high availability and fault tolerance. So those are terms that should not be new to you because we went over those terms in our lesson on the introduction to cloud terminology. So if you're unfamiliar with those terms, please take a moment to go back and take a look at that lesson. Let's go ahead and get started. So there are a couple of different ways that you can access AWS services. You can use the Aws Management Console, which is a graphical user interface. Now, we commonly refer to it as the AWS Console for short, but the official name is the Aws Management Console. It gives you access to the various AWS services. So if we go up here under services in our console, you can see that there is a list of services that are available that you can access. And it gives you the ability to provision a resource within those services or to manage those services. Now, we're not going to explore this console any further at this point because we're going to have a lesson specifically on accessing and using the AWS Management Console. Then the other way that you have to access your AWS services is programmatically using API access. Now, I kind of bundled these together, API access and your ability to use the AWS command line. So I'm going to go over here to this document, which is the AWS CLI. Now, from the AWS CLI, you're able to run commands that can affect the AWS services. You connect using what's called a terminal, and a terminal is really just a command line application that runs on your desktop. If you're on Windows, it's just called the command line. If you're on Mac or you're on a Linux desktop, then it's called terminal. And we're going to take a look at command line interfaces and how you use them to access AWS a little bit later on in the course. Now, you also have the ability to use the API. So if you look in this document, notice that it says the CLI provides direct access to the public APIs of AWS services. And you can see up here also where it talks about AWS API and CLI. So you have the command line interface where you're manually running individual commands and you're interacting with AWS services. And you would see it would be a command similar to something like this. Or you may be using the AWS SDK or software development kit and using the API interface to interact and run commands against your AWS services as well. So those are the two ways that you can access AWS. You can use the graphical user interface, the AWS Management Console, or you can programmatically connect using a terminal or command line interface and access services using the AWS CLI or using something like the AWS API. So let's go ahead and take a look at our terms. So flexibility. Flexibility gives us the ability to choose and use as many AWS services as we need. You receive a virtual platform from AWS, and then you can load the software services that you need to support your applications. So you provision a virtual network within the AWS environment called a VPC, or a virtual private cloud. And we're going to talk about VPCs more a little bit later on in the course. But once you have a VPC or your virtual network, then you're able to provision things like instances, which are basically servers that you can provision into your virtual network. And then you can install whatever applications you like onto those servers. So you have a lot of flexibility in terms of how you want to use those services. And we're going to talk more about that as we continue to go through this course. Cost effectiveness. Using cloud is much more cost effective than having to provision millions of dollars of gear within your data center. It converts your cost from a capital cost to an operational cost. What's the difference? Without getting too much into accounting terminology, basically capital cost means that you have to pay a large amount of money upfront to cover the cost of that equipment, and you can't recover that cost for a long period of time because that cost has to be depreciated over a certain number of years. Operational costs are for things that you're paying for based on them being required at that time. So like a utility bill or a employee salary, those are things that are ongoing operational costs. By using cloud services, you no longer have those capital costs, you have them as operational costs. And think about having to, every 3 to 5 years, spend millions and millions of dollars again to repeat that process. It's a never-ending cycle. So the ability to pay as you go and not have to worry about long-term contracts or upfront money for long-term commitments, and even getting discounts if you do reserve certain services for a certain period of time is very attractive to many organizations. And then you have scalability and elasticity. We talked about these before, but scalability gives us the ability to add resources on demand to accommodate growth. So in my virtual network, if I need to add additional server resources, I provision additional EC2 instances. And when my environment is elastic, if I no longer need those EC2 instances, I can shrink my environment and remove those instances, and my cost is only associated with what I'm actually using. And then you have high availability and fault tolerance. When an environment is fault tolerant, it is able to withstand the loss of a component within the infrastructure while remaining functional. We used the example before of the router in our home network, and that router having 2 ports. One port goes down, the other port stays up, so you continue to have access to the internet. Highly available systems stay operational during maintenance and system failures. So using that same example, that router is still a single point of failure. So for my environment to be highly available, I would need to have a second router in the environment where if the first router goes down, that the second router is able to actively take over and continue to pass that traffic with little or no downtime. So that's going to do it for this lesson on the primary benefits of cloud. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next lesson.